Even my close friend, someone I trusted, has turned against me. Psalm 41:9.
On a real Sunday morning that started like every other Sunday morning, with the smell of coffee in the fellowship hall, with the sound of the choir warming up in the back room, with children running through the hallways in their good clothes while their mothers called after them to slow down and act right in the house of the Lord. It started like every other Sunday, and then it didn't. His name was Reverend Earl Moses Gideon. Pastor Earl, as everyone at Calvary Hills Baptist Church called him. For 27 years, he had been the heartbeat of that congregation. The first call when the diagnosis came back bad. The voice at the graveside when words failed everyone else. The man who showed up, always, without exception, without complaint, wherever his people needed him to be. He had given that church everything. His time, his energy, his health, his money, his marriage, his youth, everything. And on that Sunday morning, the board of deacons of Calvary Hills Baptist Church stood up in front of the entire congregation and fired him. Publicly, without warning, without dignity, without a single word of gratitude for 27 years of a life poured out in service to people who were now looking at him from their pews with expressions he had never seen directed at him before. Some were shocked. Some were confused. Some, and this was the part that would stay with him longest, some were simply looking down at their hands. Pastor Earl sat in his chair behind the pulpit and listened to every word of his termination read aloud by the man he had personally recommended for the board 3 years earlier. When it was finished, he stood up, slowly, straightened his jacket, picked up his Bible, and walked out of Calvary Hills Baptist Church without a single word of anger. Nobody followed him. The doors closed behind him, and every person left inside that building believed, with complete certainty, that they would never see Reverend Earl Moses Gideon walk through those doors again. They were wrong, but not in the way any of them expected, because what was sitting on his desk in that empty office the next morning, quiet, patient, placed there by a man who had spent his last hours in the place he loved most doing the most Earl Moses Gideon thing he had ever done, was about to change every single life in that congregation. Forever. Stay with me. This is Acts of Hope. I'm Zach. And this is the story of a man who had every reason in the world to walk away from grace, and chose it anyway. If you're new to this channel, I am so glad God brought you here today. Every week on Acts of Hope, I bring you stories like Pastor Earl's. Stories about people who were broken by betrayal and chose to be better anyway. About faith that held when everything around it was falling apart. About what happens when a human being decides, truly decides, that bitterness will not be their inheritance no matter what was done to them. If that is the kind of story your soul needs right now, and I believe most of us need it more than we admit, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss what we build together on this channel. Because where Pastor Earl's story goes from here, what was in that office, what was written in those pages, and what God did because of it, you cannot afford to miss a single word. Let's begin. There's a kind of person whose presence becomes so steady, so consistent, so completely woven into the fabric of everything around them that the people closest to them stop truly seeing them. Not out of cruelty, not out of ingratitude, but the way you stop noticing the foundation of a house. The way you stop thinking about what holds the walls up until the day something cracks and you look down and realize for the first time what has been underneath you all along. Pastor Earl was that kind of foundation. When he first walked into Calvary Hills Baptist Church, the congregation was wounded. The previous pastor had left under circumstances that nobody discussed directly, but everyone carried quietly. The kind of hurt that settles into the bones of church family and makes them walk a little more carefully, trust a little more slowly, hope a little less openly than they did before. The building itself reflected the weariness of the people inside it. The roof leaked in 3 places. The paint in the fellowship hall was peeling in long strips from the ceiling. The piano in the choir stand was so out of tune that Sister Dorothy, the choir director, a small, fierce woman who had been directing that choir for longer than most members have been alive, had developed the specific skill of playing slightly around the broken notes so smoothly that visitors never noticed anything was wrong. The congregation numbered just over 100 people. Some of them were there out of habit, some out of loyalty to something they were not sure they still believed in. Some because they had nowhere else to go and a church family. Even a wounded one was still family. Earl Moses Gideon walked in on his first Sunday as their pastor, stood behind that pulpit, and looked out at every single one of those faces for a long, quiet moment before he said anything at all. Then he said, "I'm not here to impress you. I'm not here to perform for you or to build something that makes me look good. I am here because God sent me to love you, and I intend to do exactly that for as long as He allows me the privilege." He did not shout it. He did not work the room. He said it the way a man says something he has already completely decided. Nobody clapped, but something moved in that sanctuary that morning. Something quiet and real that everyone felt and nobody could name precisely. He learned their names first. All of them. Not just the names they went by on Sundays, but their full names. Their children's names. Their parents' names. Where they worked and what worried them and what they had been praying about for years without telling anyone. He did this not through formal pastoral visits announced in advance. He did it the way he did everything, by showing up, by being present in ordinary moments, by stopping in the parking lot after service to talk to the man who always left quickly because he was embarrassed about the hole in his dress shoes, by sitting in the fellowship hall long after everyone else had gone home talking with the elderly woman who had outlived her husband and two of her children and needed someone to remember with her. Within his first year, the roof was repaired. He had organized it himself, called the men of the congregation together on a Saturday morning, and worked alongside them, on his hands and knees in his work clothes on that roof, until the job was done. He had purchased half the materials himself and told no one. The fellowship hall was repainted. The piano was tuned. The broken front steps that had been a hazard for the older members were replaced with solid new ones built by a retired contractor in the congregation named Brother Henry, who said he would have done it years ago if anyone had asked. Pastor Earl had asked. By his third year, the congregation had nearly doubled. Not because he had launched a marketing campaign or printed flyers or started a social media page, but because people in that neighborhood, people who had been hurt by churches before, people who had given up on faith entirely, people who were carrying things too heavy to carry alone, kept hearing the same thing from different sources. That there was a pastor on Shelby Avenue who actually showed up. That if you called him at 10 o'clock at night, he answered. That if you were in a hospital bed, he came, not the next day, not when it was convenient, but that night, that hour, because that was when you needed him. Word spreads differently in a community that has been disappointed before. It spreads carefully, slowly, with the specific credibility that only comes from person after person saying the same thing independently. He is the real thing. And so they came. A young man named Deshaun came because his mother made him, and stayed because Pastor Earl looked at him, really looked at him, the specific direct look of a man who sees what is actually there and not what is convenient to see, and said quietly after Sunday service, "I see where you're headed, son, and I see what you could be instead. Come talk to me." Deshaun almost didn't go. He went. They sat in that office for 3 hours on a Tuesday evening. Pastor Earl did not lecture him, did not give him a list of rules or a program to follow. He simply talked to him, asked him questions, listened to the answers with the kind of complete attention that Deshaun had never experienced from any adult male in his life. He went back the following Tuesday, and the one after that, and slowly, over months that became years, Deshaun became someone different. Not because Pastor Earl fixed him, but because for the first time in his life, someone had seen him clearly enough to believe in what he could become. Deshaun is a high school principal today. He has never forgotten those Tuesday evenings. A family named the Washingtons came after their house fire left them with nothing. Pastor Earl did not make an announcement from the pulpit or organize a public collection. He quietly contacted 12 families in the congregation, coordinated everything personally, and ensured that the Washingtons had a fully furnished apartment waiting for them within 2 weeks. He never mentioned it in a sermon, never referenced it in a prayer, never allowed it to become a story about his own generosity. The Washingtons did not know for years that it was him. When they finally found out, when a member who could no longer keep the secret told them the truth, Mrs. Washington drove directly to the church and walked into his office and stood in the doorway looking at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell us it was you?" And Pastor Earl said, "Because it wasn't about me. It was about you having somewhere safe to bring your children home to." She cried. He handed her a tissue from the box he kept on his desk for exactly this kind of moment. There were marriages that came to him in pieces, couples who had stopped speaking except in anger, who had already called the lawyers, who were coming to the pastor as a formality before the end. Some of those marriages are still standing today. Not because Pastor Earl said anything magical, but because he sat with those couples in that office until they got somewhere real, until the armor came off and the actual hurt underneath was named, until the people across from each other remembered, sometimes for the first time in years, that they had once chosen each other. He would sometimes sit with a couple until midnight. He would go home exhausted. He would come back the next day and do it again. This is who Earl Moses Gideon was. This is the man who walked into that board meeting on a Saturday night with no knowledge of what was waiting for him. This is the man who sat in his chair behind the pulpit the next morning and heard his termination read aloud in the house he had given his life to build. And this is the man who stood up, straightened his jacket, picked up his Bible, and walked out without a single word of bitterness. Because Earl Moses Gideon had spent 27 years teaching one thing above everything else. That grace was not something you preached from a pulpit. It was something you lived in the hardest moments of your life. And this Sunday morning was the hardest moment of his. Every betrayal has a beginning. A moment, usually small, usually quiet, usually mistaken at first for something reasonable, where something shifts underneath the surface of a community, where pride or jealousy or hunger for control plants itself in the heart of a person who genuinely believes they are acting for the right reasons and begins to grow in the dark. At Calvary Hills, that beginning had a name. Deacon Raymond Harris. He had joined the congregation several years before the firing. Successful businessman, sharp mind, immaculate presentation. The kind of man who walked into a room and immediately made everyone in it feel that he was the most capable person there. He was not wrong about his capabilities. He was profoundly wrong about what they were for. Raymond Harris had grown up in a large, prosperous church in Atlanta. A church with a gleaming building and a well-known pastor and a congregation that measured its health in numbers and square footage and the caliber of guest speakers it could attract. He had absorbed, without fully realizing it, a particular understanding of what a successful church looked like. Calvary Hills did not look like that. Calvary Hills looked like a community, messy and real and deeply human. It looked like Sister May in the third pew who had been coming for 40 years and whose presence was as much a part of the sanctuary as the wooden cross above the altar. It looked like recovering addicts sitting next to deacons' wives, like teenagers who came because Pastor Earl had personally invited them and kept inviting them until they showed up, like an after-school program running in the community center next door, where the smell of whatever Sister Patricia was cooking drifted into the sanctuary on weekday afternoons. It looked like everything that actually mattered. But to Raymond Harris, it looked like potential that was being squandered. He joined the board of deacons with genuine enthusiasm and what he believed were genuine intentions. He brought his business mind to the church's finances, and that was genuinely useful. He asked sharp questions about budget allocations and building maintenance and long-term planning, and those were legitimate questions that needed asking. But over time, the questions changed. Or rather, what was underneath the questions changed. He began suggesting that the church needed a more dynamic vision. That Pastor Earl's approach, while admirable, was perhaps too focused on the individual and not focused enough on growth. That a church of Calvary Hills' potential, in its location, with its history, should be reaching far more people than it currently was. Pastor Earl listened to all of this carefully. He always listened carefully. And then he said something that Raymond Harris never forgot and never forgave. He said, "Raymond, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think about it honestly before you answer. When you say we should be reaching more people, what do you mean by reaching? Because we have 43 people in this congregation right now whose lives are genuinely, measurably different because of what happens in this building. 43 people who were headed somewhere dark and found their way to somewhere better here. Is that not reaching people? Or are you talking about something else? Harris said he was talking about something else. Pastor Earl nodded. I know, he said. That is what concerns me. From that conversation forward, something hardened in Raymond Harris. He was a man unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by someone he had privately already decided should be grateful for his involvement. He began working quietly, methodically, the way a businessman works when he has decided on an outcome and is reverse engineering the path to it. He cultivated relationships with two other board members, younger men who respected his success and had allowed themselves to be convinced that what Calvary Hills needed was exactly what Harris was describing. He framed his vision carefully, always in the language of ministry, always in terms of reaching more people, serving more families, building something bigger for God's glory. The conversations happened over dinners that Pastor Earl was not invited to, over phone calls made late at night, over quiet gatherings that were never called meetings because if they were called meetings, they would have to be disclosed. The narrative built slowly. Pastor Earl was aging. His approach was outdated. The church had plateaued. A change was needed. It was nobody's fault. It was simply time. 3 of the 7 deacons came to believe this completely. 2 more were worn down by repetition until they stopped resisting. 1, Deacon James Caldwell, 81 years old, who had been at Calvary Hills since before any of the other board members had been born, sat through every conversation with the expression of a man watching something terrible happening too slowly for anyone else to recognize as an emergency. He pushed back, directly, more than once. He told Harris in a private conversation that what he was building was not a vision for the church. It was a takeover, and that a man who would do this to Earl Gideon did not understand what Earl Gideon had built or what it had cost him. Harris thanked him for his perspective and kept going. The vote happened on a Saturday night. 6-1. Caldwell's was the one. He demanded that his dissent be formally recorded. Then he sat in that room with 6 men who had convinced themselves they were doing something necessary and felt something leave the room that he knew, with the certainty of 81 years of life and faith, was not going to come back easily. He drove home alone that night, sat in his kitchen until past midnight, prayed in a way he had not prayed in years. The urgent, desperate prayer of a man who has watched something wrong happen and does not know how to stop it. He did not sleep. The next morning, he dressed carefully in his Sunday suit and drove to Calvary Hills and sat in his usual pew and watched Raymond Harris stand at the pulpit and fire the most faithful man Caldwell had ever known in front of the entire congregation. He watched Pastor Earl's face when the words landed. He watched something move through that man, something that could have been rage, could have been grief, could have been the specific devastation of a person betrayed by people they genuinely loved. And he watched Earl Moses Gideon absorb every bit of it without letting a single molecule of it escape into the room. He watched him stand up, straighten his jacket, pick up his Bible, and as Pastor Earl walked down the aisle toward the door, he stopped at Caldwell's pew. Their eyes met. Caldwell's were wet. Pastor Earl put his hand on the old man's shoulder, squeezed once, gently, the way you touch someone when you want them to know, without words, without drama, that you see them and you do not blame them and you're going to be all right. Then he walked out. The doors closed, and Raymond Harris returned to the pulpit to continue the service as though a 27-year ministry had not just been ended in the space of 4 minutes. He went back to his office that afternoon. The building was quiet by then. The congregation had dispersed, some quickly, eager to put distance between themselves and what they had witnessed. Some slowly, standing in small groups in the parking lot, speaking in low voices with the stunned, careful tone of people who had just seen something they were not sure how to process. Nobody came to find him. He let himself in through the side entrance, walked down the hallway he had walked down thousands of times, past the children's ministry room where he had painted the walls himself one summer because the budget didn't allow for a contractor and he wanted the children to have something bright and good to walk into. Past the bulletin board still covered with announcements for events that he had organized and would now not be there to see happen. Past the photograph that hung outside the fellowship hall, the congregation on the front steps of the church, taken on the 20th anniversary of his pastorate. Hundreds of faces, smiling, his among them. He did not stop at the photograph. He opened his office door and went inside and sat down at his desk. The office was exactly as he had left it that morning. His sermon notes still on the desk. The sermon he had prepared the night before with the same care he brought to every sermon. The sermon he had never gotten to preach. He sat for a long time, not praying, not crying, not planning, just sitting in the specific stillness of a man who has just had something enormous happen to him and has not yet fully understood the shape of it. He looked around at 27 years. The photographs on the wall, baptisms, weddings, graduations, mission trips, community events, 27 years of ordinary sacred moments captured in frames that lined every wall. The bookshelves, floor to ceiling, worn and marked and alive, commentaries and concordances, and devotional books with pages folded down and margins dense, with his handwriting going back to the beginning. Some of those books had come with him from seminary. Some had been gifts from congregation members who knew what he loved. Some he had found in second-hand stores and carried home like found treasure. The small wooden cross above the door. Brother Thomas had carved it by hand, given it to him on his 5th anniversary at Calvary Hills. A man of few words who had expressed everything he felt about his pastor in a piece of wood shaped by his own hands over weeks of quiet evenings. Brother Thomas had been gone 15 years. Pastor Earl had preached at his funeral. He had preached at so many funerals. He had sat at so many bedsides. He had been in this community so long and so deeply that its history and his history had become impossible to separate. The people who had been born here and grown up here and built their lives here, they were not his congregation. They were his family. And family had just done the thing that only family can truly do. Not because strangers had turned against him. Strangers turning against you hurts differently. This hurt the way only love can hurt when it becomes the instrument of the wound. He opened his desk drawer, took out a yellow legal pad, uncapped his pen, and began to write. He wrote for 2 hours. What came out of him in those 2 hours was not what you might expect from a man who had just been publicly humiliated and discarded after nearly 3 decades of faithful service. There was no anger in it. There was no score settling, no careful cataloging of grievances. No list of everything he had given and everything that had been taken. He began by thanking them, genuinely, specifically, by name. Every deacon, every board member, every person who had served alongside him in any capacity. He named what each one had contributed, what each one had meant to the ministry, what each one had done, specifically, concretely, that had helped make Calvary Hills what it was. He thanked Harris. He acknowledged his financial acumen and his organizational gifts and his genuine love for the church, even as he acknowledged that they had disagreed profoundly about what that love should look like in practice. He did not pretend the disagreement had not existed. He did not pretend that what had happened had not hurt. But he thanked the man by name. Then he told them something none of them knew. He told them about the loan. The personal loan he had taken out years earlier, quietly, without telling anyone, not the board, not his wife, to cover a financial shortfall that had threatened to close the community center. A bad investment decision made by a previous treasurer had created a debt that the church could not cover from its regular income. The community center, the after-school program, the senior gatherings, the meal service for struggling families, was weeks away from having to shut its doors. He had gone to a bank alone, taken out a personal loan against his own modest assets, and deposited the money into the church account. He had repaid that loan himself over 4 years out of his own salary. He wrote, "I am not telling you this for recognition. I'm not telling you this so that you will feel badly about what happened yesterday. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something about why I made that decision and why I kept it to myself. I did not want the congregation to carry that burden. I did not want anyone to feel guilty or indebted or afraid. I wanted Sister Patricia's grandchildren to have somewhere safe to go after school. I wanted Mr. Henderson to have somewhere warm to sit on Tuesday afternoons where someone would know his name and ask about his health and treat him like he mattered. That was enough reason. That has always been enough reason for me. The work was never about me." Then he told them about the families. Not all of them. There were too many, and he had never kept a record, because keeping a record had never been the point. But enough. He told them about the families he had helped financially from his own pocket during hard seasons. Quietly, anonymously, never as loans, because a loan creates an obligation, and he did not want anyone who was already struggling to carry the weight of an obligation to their pastor on top of everything else. He told them about the young people, the ones he had driven to college campuses on his days off, the ones whose applications he had helped with at his kitchen table on Saturday mornings, the ones he had called in favors for, reaching out to people he knew, asking for opportunities on behalf of young men and women who had no one else to make those calls for them. He told them about the hospital visits that nobody had asked him to make, the 3 a.m. calls he had answered without complaint, the families he had sat with through the night in waiting rooms because they should not have to sit alone. He told them about his marriage. He told them that Gloria had been the most patient, most faithful, most genuinely good person he had ever known, and that he had not loved her as well as she deserved because he had given so much of himself to the church that there were years when she sat alone in their home and wondered if her husband knew she existed outside of the context of ministry. He told them this not to assign blame to anyone but himself. He wrote, "I tell you this so that you understand what this calling actually costs, not so that you will feel sorry for me or for Gloria. We made our choices with open eyes, and we have made our peace. I tell you because the person who stands in that pulpit next is going to face the same choices. And I want someone, at least one person in that room, to remember this letter when that person is tired and stretched thin and giving more than they're showing. Remember to see them. Remember to say thank you. Remember that the ones who carry the most are often the ones least likely to tell you how heavy it is." He wrote about forgiveness last, not quickly, not as a formality, but carefully, truthfully, the way a man writes something he has actually wrestled with and arrived at through real effort rather than easy sentiment. He wrote, "I forgive every one of you, completely, without condition, not because what happened yesterday did not hurt. It did. It hurt in ways I'm still discovering and will probably continue to discover for some time. But I have stood at too many bedsides and too many gravesides to spend whatever days God gives me from this point forward carrying bitterness toward people I genuinely love. Because I do love you, all of you. That has not changed. It will not change. Calvary Hills was never mine to hold on to. It was always his. And it is still his today, just as it was the first Sunday I stood in that pulpit and looked out at your faces and felt, with a certainty I have never questioned, that this was exactly where I was supposed to be. Serve it well. Serve each other well. Keep the doors open and the lights on and the community center running, and keep showing up for the people nobody else shows up for. That is all I ever asked of this church. That is all I ask now. Your brother in Christ, Earl." He folded the pages carefully, placed them in an envelope, wrote 3 words on the front in his careful, unhurried handwriting. "For my church." He placed the envelope in the center of his desk, stood up, took one long, slow look around his office, picked up only 2 things, his Bible and a small framed photograph of Gloria from the corner of his desk, and walked out. He did not lock the door behind him. Sister Diane Watkins arrived at Calvary Hills the next morning the way she always did, coffee in hand, keys jingling, moving with the specific, purposeful energy of a woman who had been the administrative backbone of this church for 16 years and took that responsibility seriously even on the mornings when her heart was not in it. Her heart was not in it that morning. She had not slept well. She did not think anyone connected to Calvary Hills Baptist Church had slept particularly well the night before. What had happened on Sunday morning had left a particular kind of silence in its wake. Not the peaceful silence of a community at rest, but the heavy, pressing silence of a community that had witnessed something it could not yet fully process. People had called her throughout the previous afternoon and evening. Members of the congregation, most of them, asking questions she could not answer, expressing things she did not have the words to respond to. Some were angry, some were confused, some were defending the board's decision with the slightly too emphatic conviction of people who were trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. She had listened to all of it. She had not slept. She unlocked the front door, walked down the hallway, past the bulletin board, past the children's ministry room with its bright painted walls. She stopped outside Pastor Earl's office. The door was slightly open. She pushed it gently and stood in the doorway. The office was immaculate, everything organized with a care that felt almost ceremonial. as though someone had spent time making sure every book was in its place, every surface was clear, every item was exactly where it should be. The desk was empty except for one thing: a white envelope, centered precisely, 3 words on the front. "For my church." She stood there for a long time without moving. Then she walked to the desk, very slowly, sat down in his chair. Not her chair, his chair, the chair she had sat across from hundreds of times, and picked up the envelope. She held it without opening it. She was not sure she was ready for what was inside it. She was not sure she would ever be ready. But she picked up her phone and called Deacon Caldwell. Caldwell arrived within 20 minutes. He took one look at the envelope on the desk and sat down heavily in the chair across from Sister Diane. "Call the others," he said. "All of them," she said. "All of them," he said. They gathered within the hour. 7 men in that office, the same 7 men who had been in that boardroom 2 nights ago, making the decision that had led to this moment. Standing in a circle around the desk of the man they had removed, looking at an envelope with 3 words on the front. The room was very quiet. Harris picked it up, opened it. "Read the first page." He read slowly. The room watched his face the way you watch the face of the person holding news you cannot yet see. His expression did not change dramatically, but something left it, something that had been there, the particular set of man who is certain he has done the right thing, quietly departed and did not come back. He passed the pages to the man beside him without a word. They passed around that circle one by one, each man reading, each man sitting with what he had read in a silence that grew heavier with every passing minute. When the last man finished, the room was completely still. It was Deacon Caldwell who spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. He was speaking the way a man speaks when a reckoning arrives, and he has been waiting for it and dreading it in equal measure. "What have we done?" he said. Not a question, a recognition. Harris was sitting in the corner of the room with the letter in his hands and his eyes fixed on something that was not in that office. Nobody had an answer, because there was no answer that would have been adequate. The letter had not accused them. It had not condemned them. It had done something far more difficult to absorb than accusation or condemnation. It had loved them, completely, specifically, by name. And in doing so, it had shown them, with a clarity that no argument, no confrontation, no public reckoning could have achieved, exactly what they had chosen to throw away. They found him 3 days later, not because he had made himself findable. He had gone to stay with his sister in a small town 2 hours outside Memphis. Turned his phone off, sat on her porch in the mornings with his Bible and a cup of coffee, and let the quiet settle over him the way quiet does when you finally stop running toward something and allow yourself to simply be still. He was not hiding. He was healing. He slept more than he had slept in years. He ate meals slowly, sat at his sister's kitchen table in the evenings, and talked, really talked, unhurried and completely present, in a way he had rarely allowed himself to talk during the years when there was always somewhere else he needed to be. His sister, Clara, did not ask him many questions. She was 7 years older than him and had known him his entire life and understood that he needed space more than he needed conversation right now. She fed him, made him rest, sat with him on the porch in the evenings watching the light change. On the 3rd day, she told him quietly that a man had called her landline looking for him. "Who?" he said. "James Caldwell," she said. Pastor Earl was quiet for a moment. "Tell him I'm here," he said. Caldwell arrived the next afternoon, drove 2 hours alone, did not tell the rest of the board he was coming, knocked on Clara's front door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has been rehearsing what he is going to say for 48 hours and has arrived at the conclusion that no amount of rehearsal is going to be adequate. Pastor Earl opened the door. They looked at each other. "James," he said. "Earl," Caldwell said, "I need to say some things to you. I need you to let me finish before you respond." "Come sit down," Pastor Earl said. They sat on the porch together. Clara brought them both coffee and then went inside and closed the door behind her because she understood what kind of conversation this needed to be. Caldwell told him everything. The meetings he had not been invited to. The conversations he had tried to redirect. The vote he had cast against the decision and the formal record of his dissent he had demanded be noted. He told him what had happened in the office that Monday morning. how Sister Diane had found the letter, how the board had gathered and read it standing in a circle around his desk. He described the silence that had fallen over that room and tried to find words adequate to describe what that silence had felt like, and found that there were no words adequate, and said so. He told him that Harris had not slept properly in 3 days, that he had seen the man at the church the previous morning, and Harris had looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long distance, and was beginning to understand that he was not going to be able to put it down. He told him that 2 of the other board members had already offered their resignations. He told him that the congregation was fractured, that people who had been part of Calvary Hills for decades were talking about leaving, that the after-school program in the community center was running, but the woman who ran it had pulled Caldwell aside the day before and told him quietly that she did not know how much longer she could do it with things the way they were. That it did not feel right without Pastor Earl, that something essential was gone and everyone could feel it and nobody knew how to name it exactly, but it was there. The specific absence of a person so woven into the life of a place that the place itself did not quite function properly without them. Pastor Earl listened to all of it without interrupting. He looked out at the quiet road in front of Clara's house while Caldwell talked. The late afternoon light coming through the trees. A dog moving slowly across a neighbor's yard. The specific, unhurried peace of a small town on an ordinary afternoon. When Caldwell finished, there was a long silence between them. Then Pastor Earl said, "How is Sister Patricia's granddaughter? The little one in the after-school program. She was having trouble with her reading last time I checked in." Caldwell stopped, looked at this man. "Earl, is she still coming every day?" "Yes," Caldwell said. "She's still coming." "Good," Pastor Earl said. "She just needs consistency. She just needs someone to show up for her every single day until it clicks. That's all she needs." The old deacon looked at him for a long time. At this man who had just been publicly humiliated and stripped of his position and discarded after 27 years, who had been sitting on his sister's porch for 3 days, whose very first question was about a little girl's reading progress. Caldwell's eyes filled. "Will you come back?" he said. His voice was not quite steady. "The congregation wants you back. I want you back. Earl, please. Will you come back?" Pastor Earl was quiet. He looked at his hands, at the Bible on the small table beside his chair. He thought about the office, the letter, the photographs on the wall, and the worn books on the shelves, and the wooden cross above the door that Brother Thomas had carved and given him with hands that had since gone still. He thought about Deshawn and the Washington family and Sister May in the third pew and the Tuesday evening conversations and the 3 a.m. phone calls and 27 years of ordinary sacred moments with people who would always be, his family. He thought about what it had cost. He thought about Gloria. He thought about the little girl who needed someone to show up for her every single day until something clicked. "I will come back," he said quietly. "Not for the position, not for the title, but because those are my people, and my people need someone to show up." He paused, looked at Caldwell directly. "But things will need to change, James. Real change. Not just an apology from a pulpit and a handshake and an assumption that everything goes back to normal. Real accountability. Real restructuring of how decisions get made in that church. Real safeguards so that what Harris built in those meetings can never be built again. Can you commit to that?" Caldwell straightened in his chair. Something settled in his old face. Something that had been uncertain for days became certain. "Yes," he said. Simply. Completely. Pastor Earl nodded. Picked up his coffee cup. "Then finish your coffee," he said. "And then let's go home." He came back on a Sunday morning. No announcement had been made. No special service planned. No marquee sign out front declaring his return. He simply arrived early, the way he always had, and stood at the front door of Calvary Hills Baptist Church in his good suit with his Bible under his arm and greeted people as they came in. The first person through the door was a young mother with 2 small children who had joined the congregation 2 years earlier. She saw him and stopped walking completely. Then she started crying. He hugged her, told her it was all right, held the door open for her children. The next person was an elderly man who had been coming to Calvary Hills for 30 years. He shook Pastor Earl's hand and held it for a long time without saying anything, and Pastor Earl held it back, and that was enough. By the time the service began, the sanctuary was fuller than it had been in months. People who had been staying away in protest of what had happened had come back when word spread quietly through the community that he was returning. People who had never been to Calvary Hills had come because someone they trusted had called them and said, "You need to be there this Sunday." Trust me, Sister May was in her usual seat in the third pew. White dress, hands folded, eyes bright and watchful and completely unsurprised. The expression of a woman who had prayed specifically and persistently for exactly this outcome and had never genuinely doubted that it was coming. When Pastor Earl walked down the aisle toward the pulpit, something happened in that building that no one who was present that morning has ever been fully able to describe adequately. It started with Sister May. She stood up, slowly, with the careful, deliberate effort of 81 years. She rose from her pew and stood. The woman beside her stood. Then the row behind her. Then the row behind that. It moved through that sanctuary like something alive, like a tide coming in, like light spreading, until every single person in that building was on their feet. Not applauding, not shouting, just standing, in the specific reverent silence of a community that understood, without anyone saying it, that they had nearly lost something irreplaceable and that by the grace of God, only by the grace of God, they had not lost it after all. Pastor Earl stood at the pulpit, looked out at all of them, at every face he knew, at every story he carried, at 27 years of a life shared with these people in the ordinary, sacred, difficult, beautiful mess of actually living together in faith. And he wept, not quietly, not with the restrained, dignified emotion of a man performing grief for an audience. He wept the way a man weeps when he has been holding something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place where it is safe to put it down. The congregation wept with him. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound of it filled that sanctuary and became something communal, a shared release of everything that had been held and carried and unspoken for weeks. Harris was in the congregation. He had not sat with the deacons. He had come in quietly and taken a seat in the back and sat through all of it, through the standing, through the weeping, through the specific weight of being present in a room full of people experiencing the return of something that his choices had taken away. He did not look away. He sat with it, all of it, because that was the only honest thing left for him to do. When Pastor Earl finally spoke, when the weeping quieted and the room settled into the specific attentive stillness of people ready to receive something, he said only this: "I'm not here today because I am owed anything. I'm not here because justice was done or because anyone has been properly held accountable for what happened. That work is still ahead of us, and we will do it together, honestly and with integrity. I am here because you are my family, and I have never in my life been able to stay away from my family for long." He paused. "I'm also here because there's a little girl in our after-school program who needs someone to show up for her every single day until something clicks. And I intend to be here for that." Somewhere in the middle of the congregation, a woman laughed softly through her tears. Then another. Then the sound of it moved through the room like the standing had moved, gently, irresistibly, until the laughter and the tears were happening together the way they do in moments of genuine grace when a community remembers what it actually is. He preached that morning on forgiveness. Not the easy kind, not the kind that costs nothing and changes nothing and is really just a way of saying, "I will pretend this did not happen," because confronting it is inconvenient. He preached about the kind of forgiveness that looks betrayal directly in the face and names it clearly and grieves it honestly, and then makes the active, costly, daily decision to release it. The kind that does not require the other person to deserve it. The kind that is not for the person who hurt you. The kind that is entirely for you and for what God can do in the space that bitterness would otherwise occupy. Harris resigned from the board that week. He did not leave the church. That was the part that surprised people. He stayed, sat in the congregation, started over. The specific, slow, humble work of a man who has genuinely reckoned with what he has done and decided that running away from it would be the last cowardice. He showed up, said little, did what was asked of him, contributed where he could without seeking recognition. It took time. There were members of the congregation who did not make it easy for him. Pastor Earl, from the pulpit and in private, asked the congregation to extend to Harris the same grace that had been extended to all of them at one point or another. Not to forget what had happened, but to leave room for a person to become someone better than who they had been. Some did. Some took longer. But the room was made. The door was left open, because that was what Calvary Hills Baptist Church did. The community center expanded the following year. A new wing, a reading program specifically designed for children who were struggling. More families served. More evenings lit up and warm and full of purpose. Deshaun drove down from Nashville for the dedication ceremony of the new reading room. Stood in the parking lot of the church he had been dragged to as a teenager and told anyone who would listen exactly why he was there and exactly what had happened in that office all those years ago on a Tuesday evening when a man had looked at him and seen not what he was, but what he could become. He had funded the new reading room himself. He named it for a little girl who was learning to read. Sister May lived to see it open. She sat in the front row at the dedication in her white dress with her hands folded and her eyes bright. After the ceremony, she made her way to Pastor Earl and took both his hands in hers and held them for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "I told the Lord. I got down on my knees the night after they did what they did, and I told him, don't you let the enemy win this one. Don't you let that good man go. This church needs him, and he needs this church, and you did not bring him here for 27 years just to let it end like that." Pastor Earl smiled. He listened, he said. Sister May patted his hands the way she had been patting the hands of people she loved for 81 years. "He always does," she said. "We just have to hold on long enough to see it." I want to say something to you before I close. About the Pastor Earls in your world. There are people in your life right now who have been quietly, faithfully, invisibly serving. Showing up, carrying weight that nobody sees and that they would never think to complain about. People who have given the best of themselves to something, to a family, to a community, to a calling, without ever asking anyone to notice. And some of them right now, today, are sitting somewhere alone. Not because they have no one, but because the people they gave everything to got comfortable. Got busy. Stop looking back. Look back. Call them today. Not next week. Today. And if you are the one who has been betrayed, if you're sitting somewhere right now, trying to decide whether bitterness gets to be the end of your story, I want you to hear what Pastor Earl heard in that quiet office before he picked up that pen. Grace is not weakness. Forgiveness is not surrender. Choosing to love people who have hurt you is not foolishness. It is the most powerful thing a human being can do because it creates space for God to move. And when God moves, when you hold on long enough, when you choose grace over and over in the small moments and the impossible ones, He does not simply restore what was lost. He builds something better than what was there before. Hold on long enough to see it. I'm Zach. This is Acts of Hope. If this story reached something real inside you today, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs it. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between bitterness and grace? What did you choose? I want to know. Until next time, love people, forgive loudly, show up always. God bless every single one of you. White heavy checkmark subscribe. New stories of hope every week. White heavy checkmark watch next. He worked 3 jobs and never missed a single day. The day he collapsed, his family had already moved on. White heavy checkmark comment. Have you ever had to choose between bitterness and grace? White heavy checkmark share. Someone needs this story today.